Started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this all-party parliamentary group Africa meeting with Afrobarometer. I'd just like to start by saying, for those who may not be familiar with us, that the all-party parliamentary group for Africa is well, as the name implies, is a cross-party, in fact, indeed, cross-house group of MPs and peers who come together because of an interest in Africa, and our aims are to improve mutually beneficial relationships between the United Kingdom and the continent of Africa, as well as addressing some of the negative stereotypes which sadly still too often prevail in our country's views on Africa. And we're one of the most, I think we are the most popular and active groups, or party parliamentary groups in Parliament. We meet regularly and produce a number of highly thought of reports. Our secretariat is provided by the Royal African Society, and I want once again to thank them for their support in organising today's meeting. Now, one of my favourite quotations is from Florence Nightingale, who was also stereotypically known as the woman who founded nursing, but actually is also helped found the modern day. Sorry about that ringing. That's it's not a vote, thankfully. The end of the parliamentary day here. Florence Nightingale also founded the science of statistics, and one of her quotes was, "We must study statistics because it is through statistics that we understand God's intentions." Now, I put it like that, but I would say that the only way to understand how and whether the sort of legislators promote are working is to look at the data, and understanding and having access to data, to high quality data, is an essential part of any attempt at policy making. In this era of post-truth, fact flags, it's critical, really critical, to be able to access high quality and reliable statistical data. And that's why I'm so pleased that today that we're having this open discussion with Afrobarometer. They're a non-partisan Pan-African research institution which conducts public attitude surveys on democracy, governance, the economy and society in over 30 countries in a repeated regular cycle. So they collect and publish high quality, reliable statistical data on Africa, which critically is freely available to the public. They are going to be the world's leading source of high quality data on what Africans are thinking. And I'm really pleased that today Boniface Delani will present their most recent research. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask Bonnie, who's the Director of Surveys at Afrobarometer, to present their most recent research, and then afterwards we'll be able to take a short time for questions. So I think have you got I think you've got a slideshow ready to go, Bonnie? I think you're classic. You're on mute, so I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay.
Great. You put it onto slideshow. Great.
Thank you. And thank you for really giving us this opportunity. I hope you can hear me and you can see my slides. As per the introduction, I'm the Director of Surveys for the Afrobarometer, and I'm joined by my Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Joseph Asunka. In terms of, I think, introducing Afrobarometer, I think you've already introduced us in the sense that we're a Pan-African network of survey researchers operating in more than 30 countries. Indeed, we do our surveys in regular cycles, as it's already been said, covering most of Africa. And at the moment, we've just embarked on our 9th cycle of surveys, and it is our aim to cover up to 40 countries during this cycle of surveys. So in my presentation this morning, or this afternoon rather, I will be talking about some of our key findings from our recent surveys, focusing on a number of topics. But just to highlight the fact that we do cover such a wide range of topics that what I'm just presenting this afternoon is just a very, very brief snapshot of what is available. And we are always also available as a network to provide more detailed analysis on particular topics or indeed countries. In terms of how we collect our data, I think for a long time, we know that a lot of people have talked and spoken about Africa and for Africans, including political leaders, civil society, activists, you name it, all of them claiming to be the voice of the people. But most of the time, these kind of voices really do not consult the people themselves. So Afrobarometer really seeks to fill this gap by speaking directly to the people. So our surveys are done by national partners in each country that we work in, and these are also responsible not only for collecting data, but for also disseminating the key findings at a country level. Our surveys are done face-to-face in the language of respondents' choice, although in recent times we are exploring other ways of collecting data, including telephone surveys. And we do use nationally representative samples of adult citizens aged 18 and above, so that everyone really above the age of 18 is given an equal and same chance of being selected in these surveys. And we do use standard questionnaires. This allows us to compare our findings across the countries. But some of our questions are also carried over from each survey round to the next, so that we also have a base for comparing our findings over time as well as across different countries. We use standard samples of either 2,400 for some countries or 1,200, which is our really default sample size. And this does give us, if the 2,400 gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 2%, and then samples of 1,200 give us a margin of error of plus or minus 3% at the 95% confidence interval. So just to share some of our key findings, as I said, I will just give you a snapshot of citizens' priorities, as well as assessments of government performance. And then I'll tend to look at some of our findings on governance, especially in terms of democracy and the demand and the supply of democracy on the continent as seen from the perspective of ordinary citizens. So my starting point is just to share with you what ordinary African citizens themselves consider to be the most important problems facing their countries that they would want governments to address. And this presentation really is comparing the findings from 2011 and then 10 years later in about 2021. We find that across the African continent, at least in the countries, in 30 countries for which this data are available, the most common problem that is highlighted is unemployment. In some cases, as you'll see in a moment, I think our survey respondents are very specific in actually citing youth unemployment as the biggest problem facing the continent at the moment. And we've seen, I think, over time, I think changes in terms of a slight change really in the proportion of citizens on the continent, that about about 1/3 really cite unemployment as the main problem, and this has remained more or less the same. Health has also begun to emerge as a major, a major issue. And this is perhaps not surprising given, I think, the current pandemic times that we are living in. Education also is also a major issue for most people, as are infrastructure and water supply. Poverty and destitution, it's kind of declined in terms of importance over time, but it still remains quite a major problem. And other issues include availability of not only electricity, but reliable electricity, food shortages, corruption, agriculture and farming, as well as wages and housing. But of course, this is at the continental level. But when we dig down into the data by looking at what are the commonest problems, and we see that again, as already depicted in the previous slide, unemployment is a major problem that is cited by most, or at least a majority or a plurality of respondents in many countries. But other countries, notably in West Africa, that have experienced recent insecurity and upheavals, they do cite crime and insecurity, as we see in Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, in Mali, and also in Cape Verde. Other issues that are again cited that are the top issues in some of the countries include infrastructure and roads as the main problem in Ghana and Guinea, as well as in Liberia. And then food shortages also emerge as the top problem that citizens of Malawi, Niger, as well as Sierra Leone cite as being most important, and asking their governments really to address this as the top priority. But in others, it's management of the economy in Sudan, in Uganda, and the Gambia, and then health in Tanzania and Uganda as the top issues, and corruption is cited as the top issue that Kenyan citizens would want their governments to address. Not surprisingly, given the development challenges that most African countries face, many respondents really say that overall they feel that their countries are going in a wrong direction. And we see, I think, Tanzanians and Moroccans really, large majorities really worried that their countries are headed, in Tanzania, people feel that their countries are heading in the right direction, but overall, we find that about 2/3 say their countries, when you look at data from 34 countries, are headed in wrong direction. And this really applies in countries like Gabon, Mali, Lesotho, Namibia, Liberia, Tanzania, Zambia, and others. So the countries where the citizens are more optimistic include Tanzania, Ethiopia, Uganda, and also Mozambique. And then we also look at a question. We ask our respondents how they would describe the present economic conditions of their country. Overall, again, citizens tend to hold a negative picture in terms of the overall condition of their country. Again, there are countries that are like Mozambique and Tanzania, where citizens are much more optimistic in terms of the overall condition of the country, but just barely majorities really say so. But on average, again, 6 in 10 citizens really hold negative views on economic conditions in their countries, which is not surprising really when you consider that again, the management of the economy, poverty, and others are cited as major challenges in most countries on the continent. Again, I apologize if I'm going too fast, but I know that we did share the slides, and as I said, we will be quite happy to answer questions and to provide much more specific details on this and other topics. Moving on from the economic situation and the most commonly cited problems, I just want just to give a snapshot of support for democracy and democratic norms. So I will focus on the demand side of democracy and whether African citizens demand democracy by looking at a number of measures, and then I will contrast that with the perception of the supply of democracy to see whether African citizens want democracy and whether they think they're getting it. Indeed, when you look at recent developments on the continent where we've had military coups that have been celebrated, this has led to some people to start to question on whether African citizens are committed to democracy and that do they support it, or are they also considering authoritarian alternatives like military rule as a possible option if democracy is seen to be failing. So we do ask our citizens whether which statement is closest to their views, whether democracy is always preferable to any other kind of government, or whether in certain circumstances they would prefer non-democratic governments, or indeed whether it does not matter really for them what type of government. And by almost 7 in 10 citizens in the 34 countries for which we have recent data, almost 7 in 10 of our citizens say democracy is always preferable to any other kind of government. So support for democracy is not only strong, but we also see that it has held steady even despite the economic challenges that our African citizens say they are experiencing. And we also do ask whether citizens, because it's one thing for people just to say, I support democracy, but then we also ask them, I think, more questions on their commitment to democracy, including whether they reject authoritarian alternatives, including military rule, one-party rule, and one-man rule, or dictatorship rather. So we again see that the rejection of these 3 forms of authoritarian rule remaining quite high. Almost 3/4 say they do not want military rule. Rejection of one-party rule also remains quite strong, with again about just slightly over 3 in 4, and just over 8 in 10 saying that they do not want one-man dictatorship. So this really goes to suggest that even when we see military coups on the continent and supposedly people going on the streets to express their support for these military coups, the people who do so really are in a minority, and that large majorities of African citizens really reject these authoritarian forms of government. And I think, on the side there, we show also that the rejection of military rule, for example, is very high across the continent, even though there are a few countries like Burkina Faso where rejection of military rule is slightly lower, and in Tunisia it's just just breaking between support and rejection of this type of government. And we see that over time, generally speaking, rejection of authoritarian alternatives has held steady. So it's not like it's a one-off. For example, military rule, one-man rule rejection in 2011 was at 82%, and it's fluctuated in between, but it remains at 82% across 30 countries in 10 years later in 2021. And we see the same picture in rejection of one-party rule and the military rule. But as Afrobarometer, we also then compare that, who are the people who reject all these 3 authoritarian alternatives and at the same time express support for democracy. So because we look at this as really a measure of demand for democracy, that a true and committed Democrat should not only say I support democracy, but they should also reject all 3 types of authoritarian rule. So not surprising, given that this is much more stringent measure, the numbers tend to be lower. And this is here that we see that between 2011 and 2021, there's been a decline in demand for democracy from 49% in 2011 to 44% in 2021. So I think given the challenges, maybe economic as well as the security and political challenges, maybe this might be having some impact in eating away the commitment that African citizens have towards democracy. But we also do ask questions that look at support for presidential term limits. As we know, we have had several cases of presidents who have sought removal of presidential term limits, and usually claiming that these have popular public support. But again, across various measures, we see that commitment, even though it's declined, but it still remains majorities nearly of 2/3 and above of citizens saying they support presidential term limits, and they also want the presidency to comply with court decisions and also commit to elections as a way of choosing leaders and also supporting parliamentary oversight of the executive, as well as supporting multi-party competition and the preference for accountable government. So overall, I think the story from this slide is that the African citizens really are very committed to democratic norms, even though over time we see fluctuations, but overall majorities really support and express support for these democratic norms. Just to highlight, I think, support for presidential term limits across 34 countries. And we see that overall in all 34 countries, majorities really express support for presidential term limits. Even in countries that have tampered or changed these rules, or that have dropped these tenure rules, for example, in Cameroon, where term limits were removed, still we find that almost 3/4 of citizens there express preference for these rules. So term limits also continue to enjoy support, great support among the African population. Now, moving away from the demand side, just to look very briefly on the supply side, we ask, first of all, our respondents whether they are satisfied with the way democracy is working and is operating in their countries, and also whether they consider their countries to be democracies. So here we find that overall, just barely over half of citizens, at 51% across the 34 countries, consider their countries as either a democracy or democracies with minor problems. And of course, Tanzanians are the most enthusiastic about their democracy, as are Botswana and Ghanaians. But at the bottom end of the scale, we see, Basotho, Gabonese, Sudanese, Malis, and Maswati from Eswatini, or previously Swaziland, as well as Zimbabwe, expressing disappointment at the quality of democracy in their countries. And not surprisingly, satisfaction levels also vary across the countries, and with the countries, by and large, those who think their countries are democracies are also expressing greater satisfaction in the quality of democracy in their country. But overall, just barely, 1/3 of citizens on the continent express satisfaction with the way democracy is working in their country. So we generally see that the satisfaction, the supply side, I think, of democracy is kind of lagging behind compared to demand. And I think this also is highlighted in this slide that shows, again, the proportion of African citizens perceiving their countries to be democratic to have declined from 40% in 2011 to 35%. The same picture, of decline in satisfaction with the way democracy is working, as well as the quality of democracy. And we see declines, I think you all know these 3 measures over the 10-year period. So the main story from this is that there are problems, and increasing problems on the supply side of democracy. And as I said, we see this deficit that demand for democracy but over time is exceeding the perception of the supply of democracy. So just to to mention here that as much as this is a concern, that obviously African citizens want more democracy on average than what they are getting in terms of quality as well as satisfaction of the democracy. It is a concern indeed that demand exceeds supply, but at the same time, we are encouraged that commitment to democracy remains stronger, even if citizens on the African continent feel that the supply side is really lacking and lagging behind. Because demand is higher than supply, we expect that there will always be pressure for democratic reforms from below. The main concern here would be if demand really was to go below supply, in which case we believe that authoritarian leaders could take advantage and reduce the supply of democracy without really fearing public backlash against that. Lastly, we also have some findings on COVID-19. And these were asked in about 15 countries because the COVID-19 really pandemic hit at a time when we had already launched surveys in other countries. So very briefly, because I've run out of time, we find that awareness of COVID-19 it remains very high, almost universal in Benin and Liberia and Togo and Mauritius. Even in the few countries where it's lagging behind in Zimbabwe, it's still very high. So almost really more than 8 in 10 citizens on the continent said they had heard of COVID-19 and were aware of government efforts to address that, the pandemic. Governments also get different, scores in terms of their performance in handling COVID-19. Generally speaking, very high, scores when it comes to keeping public informed and also managing the response to the pandemic, but low scores in trust in government, especially government statistics on COVID, and also concerns that levels of corruption are quite high when it comes to using resources meant for COVID-19. We've also asked about, attitudes towards COVID-19 vaccine and find that, by and large, there's a variation in countries that where citizens, majorities in Morocco, Mauritius say they are willing to accept the vaccine, but also in other countries where, citizens are less likely to express, likelihood of taking the vaccine. So overall, just less than half of our surveyed countries in the 15 country citizens said that they were likely to take the vaccine. And we also see this, there's a relationship between trust in government's ability to ensure safety of the vaccine as well as willingness to take the vaccine. So there's a close correlation or relationship between the two. The more people trust government's ability to ensure safety of the vaccine, the more likely they say they will take the vaccine. We see no difference in the likelihood of taking the vaccine by gender, although rural citizens, I think, are more likely to say they would take the vaccine compared to urban residents, and also older citizens expressing slightly more interest in willingness to take the vaccine, but no effect of education. And then in terms of lived poverty, there's some effect there, especially among those with no lived poverty, saying they're less likely to take the vaccines. And again, the pandemic has also created challenges in terms of restrictions on freedom, freedoms and during in handling the pandemic. But overall, we find that citizens on the continent are willing to accept the use of the security forces to enforce public health mandates, including wearing of face masks, as well as slight majorities saying that it's justifiable to limit to even postpone elections and limit election campaigns during the pandemic, as well as just and even a split in citizens who say that the media should be censored as part of the pandemic. So this slide just breaks down the proportion of citizens in the various countries in terms of support for postponing elections censoring pandemics. And I think I will stop here given the time. And I thank you, and I look forward to taking the questions from all of you. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thanks so much, Bunny. There's a lot there's a huge amount there. Actually, and I could have gone on listening to what you were saying for a lot longer. It's sort of good. It's so great to have clear sort of statistics on African voices. I should just say that I haven't got the slides. At least I certainly don't have them in front of me. So it would be great to have them. And I also like to know whether the report is available online. But what you sent us through there, buddy, was a lot of really interesting data. If we just look at the attitudes to the COVID vaccination, for example, and the levels. I can't remember the exact levels, but I think the levels of willingness to take the vaccine are much lower than in Europe, in most European countries. I also think, I don't know whether you included it or had against it the levels compared with the actual levels of existing vaccination, because those are also my, I think understanding is that it was only 2% of penetration of the vaccine in Nigeria, for example. So I wondered just generally, do you do analysis on the sort of the data that you've presented to us to look at kind of trends by country and across country? I saw that you looked at the Jack's just posted the slides. I think he's posted the slides. I'm not sure that I can. Okay, yeah, Jack's just posted the slides in the. Jack's posted the slides. I'm not sure I can save them. So how much further analysis do you kind of do in tracking against other areas?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't know whether we should take a round of questions, or I should respond to that first.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
So perhaps while we wait for further questions, I mean, the issue of COVID obviously is something that is evolving, and as the researchers ourselves, we've also had to respond to an evolving pandemic. So when we collected this data at the very beginning of 2020, I think, and 2021, earlier this year, a lot of countries hadn't started to offer vaccinations to their citizens. I think what we see here, I think we are more the views towards the vaccine at a time when the vaccines were not on offer. So now that we have launched our round 9 of surveys, we are also following up on these questions on willingness to take vaccines, and also to try and get, I think, a much more nuanced understanding of the reasons for hesitancy to take the vaccines. So we are trying to see what are the reasons, some of the reasons that people refuse to take the vaccines. But since we've just started to collect the data at the moment, we haven't done any analysis on some of the reasons why people refuse to take the vaccines. Perhaps, Joe, you can help me out here.
Yes, so I just want to step in and say one other thing. When we collected this data, we tried to actually disaggregate by demographic characteristics. And one of the key areas was to try and track this conspiracy theory out there that says that COVID-19 is a disease of the rich. And then what we have seen in this data is that that is the pattern that is emerging, that wealthier people are more likely to take the vaccine compared to poorer people. And so this does give us a signal that if there's a vaccine rollout, to think about what it means in poorer communities, whether or not they're going to take it, because it's likely that they're going to see this as a disease of the rich, and they don't see the reason why they should take it. And I think the Afrobarometer data does provide that, so that we're careful in our rollout of the vaccine and thinking about how inequitable it can be if we don't take into account the fact that this theory, conspiracy theory is out there, and provide education that will bring people around.
Sorry, Joseph, could you just talk me through that again about it being a disease of the rich?
Can you say that again?
Could you just explain to me again why it's perceived to be a disease of the rich?
Yeah, so this is just a conspiracy theory, and this has been circulated in several social media networks everywhere. And so when you talk to people, you walk in the market and ask people, most of the time you hear that they say, this is a disease of the rich. It's not, it doesn't affect poor people. And that is what we are actually picking from the data. And I think this is a good signal to warn against, especially when vaccines become more available, who is more likely to take it. And I think it provides the opportunity to carry out education even before the rollouts start if we get more vaccines.
Actually, it'd be very interesting to know what the most popular conspiracy theories in different African countries were compared to the most popular conspiracy theories here in the UK. For instance, but thank you very much for that. Can I just ask if there's any questions to put them in the chat or to raise their hand? And I see that actually Nick has raised his hand. Do you have a question, Nick?
Thank you very much, G, and thanks very much, Bonnie, for that very full and interesting explanation of your results. I had questions about two specific countries, actually. And one was Ethiopia, where we saw a very high satisfaction rate with both the development model and the political model. And I wondered what date your data was collected in Ethiopia, because the past year has been less encouraging. And the second was in relation to Tunisia, which is generally regarded as one of the most democratic and open societies, and yet where the level of dissatisfaction with the system appears very high, and actually the tolerance for potential military rule also looks remarkably high. And again, I'd be quite interested in what date the data was collected then, if you have that information, because again, things have been changing quite a lot lately, and whereas people may have been feeling very unhappy with it before, they might be feeling even more unhappy with it now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for those questions, Nick. I think both Ethiopia the survey was in 2019, so it preceded, I think, the current political problems in the country. But we've always found, Ethiopia to be an interesting country, that support for the government, for the regime, has always really been high. Our first survey in Ethiopia was actually in 2011, and some of the many surprising results from that survey is that Ethiopians were by far more likely to say that their country is a democracy compared to any other African country. So we actually did take time off for maybe 2 survey rounds just to try and dig deeper into the Ethiopian data to see if this might have been influenced by fears of insecurity, and that people are just telling us that, yes, I think we are a democracy, we support the regime, we like our development model, as you've highlighted. So we actually didn't do surveys in Ethiopia for about 2 rounds after the first time we were in there. But then eventually we decided that, well, if our goal is to give citizens, ordinary citizens, a voice, then if Ethiopians think they are democratic and they are happy with their system, or that they also are happy with their development model, then by all means, I think this is their view, and it should not be up to us as experts to define democracy for them to say that you are not a democracy or your model is not ideal. But of course, we are also looking forward to the next round of surveys to see what findings we are going to have in Ethiopia next year, and whether I think there will be some regional differences. And indeed, maybe even this data is aggregate at the national level, we can do some much more detailed analysis to see if there are differences between the different provinces or regions of Ethiopia. So it's possible that Tigray might have different, views on the democracy and the development model than, say, the capital, Addis Ababa, for example. Tunisia also has recently faced quite a lot of challenges, and really, the democracy there has been under a lot of stress. Indeed, I think at the moment we've been having even challenges to disseminate or to share some of our findings because of the political environment in Tunisia. So indeed, some of these findings really can also serve as a signal about the stress that democracy on the continent, not only in Tunisia, is facing. Because if you have many people like this saying they would accept the military rule, then of course these are the likely countries where if a military coup were to happen, we are likely to see people going on in the streets to celebrate the overthrow of democratic government. So just much like Joe is saying, that I think our engagements really need also to be particularly focused and driven by the data to see where the warning signs are. And it's clear, I think, in Tunisia, the warning signs are there, that the things are really not headed in the right direction, and the people are really looking at alternatives to democracy.
Thank you. I was also very interested at the, I'm just looking at it now, the most important problem by country, where, as you said, we saw sort of, 4 countries, including Nigeria, where that was crime and insecurity. Did you, I suppose my question would be, and perhaps I missed this, and I should know this, have you seen this changing over time? Have you not seen this from previous years? And so I wonder whether it's a response to very recent and current local issues. And I also wondered to what extent one could see climate change in some of these concerns. But I mean, for example, Ethiopia water supply and crime and insecurity, Sierra Leone food shortages and famine. And some of the crime and insecurity in Nigeria, some of that is potentially caused by the impact of climate change.
Thank you. So the question on what's the most important problem is one that we always ask in all our survey rounds. So certainly there's a possibility for us there to do an overtime analysis to see if there have been changes. I would not be surprised, especially on crime and insecurity, that this is something that is influenced by developments in the country. So I think the emergence of crime and insecurity, for instance, in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria, it might be a relatively new phenomenon. But I will be honest, I think I haven't really gone back to look at the overtime trends, but that's something that we can certainly do. But I would think that the default problem really the main problem tends to be unemployment, and we've seen this over time. But the emergence of some of these issues might be, as you rightly note, really a reflection on the current situation on the ground. And the same thing, I think, about Ethiopia and issues to do with environment and climate change. I should also add that in the new round of surveys that we have just started, we do have an extensive module on environmental governance and climate change, where we are really trying to get more data and more details on the perceptions towards climate change. So hopefully at the end of the current round, we will even have more data on the perceptions on climate change, including the role of individual citizens in addressing climate change.
That would be quite fascinating, and particularly now just after COP26, to see the extent. I was trying to get a view of the extent to which it was COP26 was seen as something at all impacting ordinary Africans. Now we've got a question from Jack. Do you want to ask your question yourself?
Yes, thank you. If I can turn that on. So I was wondering, are you able to break down the data to get a picture of attitudes within a country across different regions? For example, I'd be very interested to know about the difference in attitudes towards democracy and the main problem they think that their government has across different regions in Sudan. I imagine there'll be very different answers you'll get from, say, Darfur, Blue Nile, and Khartoum.
Yeah, so thank you, Jack. I think that is possible, but with a caveat, because the sample size with say 1,200, if you are like, say, you know, I'll give you an example of Kenya, for instance, where they have 49 counties. So if you distribute the sample by county, and because it's proportional to the population, it means that counties that have smaller populations are not as represented in the sample compared to those that have larger population sizes. So if once you start to disaggregate by region, then of course the margin of error really tends to go up quite significantly. But for most countries, yes, it's possible to disaggregate by region, because there are still enough observations by region that we can make some informed really analysis on the findings. But below the regional level, then I think things become really more difficult, because then the margin of error just really goes up really significantly. But certainly, I think, you know, in the case of the Sudan and most other countries, it's possible to take a look at that breakdown. But in terms of over time, though, you know, now, as I'm saying, we are at 40 countries. When we started off as Afrobarometer in 1999, we only had 12 countries, and then we progressively, added countries over time. So there will be some countries where we can, yes, provide even across time analysis from 1999 up to 2021, and then others as they based on at what point they were added to the network.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think actually we are out of time. Did you say whether this is available online?
So the data for Afrobarometer usually are posted online, and there are also quite a lot of some of our analytical reports posted online. And of course, the more recent data might not be available online, but we are always available and ready to share that, I think, upon a request. Maybe Joe, you can weigh in on this one.
Yeah, no, I was just going to
hand over to Joseph now to make some closing comments.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Chi. And I just wanted to follow up briefly on Jack's question about the sample size in terms of disaggregating to region levels. That's what we're trying to now experiment to see whether, at least in one country, if we do get funding, to increase the sample size to the point where we can actually do regional breakdowns and get detailed information. So if there's a specific country like Sudan that somebody is interested in, that is a possibility that we can expand the sample size and try to do a regional breakdown. But just to run up and say a big thank you to you for putting this together. It's really been a pleasure to engage with you. And as Bonnie mentioned, we have quite an extensive model on climate change and environmental governance and others, including COVID-19, that we hope to be able to cover 40 countries. So I'm hoping that once the 9th round of the surveys are completed, we may be able to come back to you with more detailed and nuanced data on these two topics, which are at the top of everybody's minds. But overall, to say thank you so much, Chief, for pulling this together and organizing this. This has really been super helpful. And I would love to continue to engage with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Africa in particular, because we think we put this big data together so that policy actors like yourselves can use. And we're always happy to provide analysis whenever you need. So thank you so much. And thanks so much, Nick, for being the orchestrator of all of this. It's really been great. And thanks, Jack, for coordinating everything. We're so grateful.
So thanks to you and Joseph for the excellent contributions. I do want to also echo your thanks to Jack and Nick and the Royal Africa Society for their organisation support. And I know that Jack's put in the chat that several MPs are looking forward to receiving the report. So that would be appreciated. I also think it would be useful for Jack to let you know the dates of our Foreign Office questions for MPs, because that's an opportunity. If you have some data that you feel is relevant or topical, that's an opportunity for us to ask questions which are around it. And yeah, I think it would be really good to sort of have regular kind of updates on areas that might be of interest to our priorities around economic development, health, and democracy in particular. Okay.
Great.
Okay. All right.
So
Thank you very much. Thanks
all
very
right.
much.
And we'll follow up with Jack. Thank you very much.
Thank you, G.
Thank you.
Joseph.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.